We all know that Switzerland was a white, neutral spot in the middle of war-torn Europe during the Second World War. But if we look at the map, we notice another country that managed to remain neutral until the end of the war, even though it was completely surrounded by the Axis powers. We are talking about Sweden. The country is over 13 times the size of Switzerland, is located fairly centrally in Scandinavia, and has a very long, rather difficult to defend border with its neighbors, which were in the hands of the enemy. And we know that the Germans were not very interested in declarations of neutrality. Countries like the Netherlands, Denmark and Norway did the same, and yet it was only a matter of time before they were conquered. So how did Sweden remain neutral until the end of the war? How did it avoid being conquered by the Germans, and how neutral was Sweden in reality? We look at all these questions in today's video. Have fun! Sweden already had a long period of neutrality before the Second World War. This went back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when Sweden lost a third of its entire territory with Finland. Finland had previously belonged to Sweden for 6 centuries, not as a colony but as an integral part of the country. This event was deeply engraved in Swedish DNA, and the motto of constant neutrality developed in foreign policy. And it more or less maintained this in all subsequent European wars, including the First World War. However, neutrality was soon to be put to the test, and once again Finland was the trigger. The neighboring country was invaded by the Soviet Union on November 30, 1939, and Sweden feared that it would be the next country to fall victim to Soviet expansion. They also wanted to support the Finns. In the so-called Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland, Sweden therefore did not declare its traditional neutrality, but declared itself a non-belligerent state. The country supplied a large amount of military equipment, and a volunteer army of over 8,000 men, the Swedish Corps, intervened in the war. Officially, however, the Swedish government continued to declare itself neutral. And the situation for Sweden became even worse when the Germans expanded from the other side. In April 1940, the German Reich invaded Denmark and Norway and occupied both countries, even though they had actually declared their neutrality. It now seemed only a matter of time before Sweden would be attacked either from the east or the west, with the main threat coming from the Germans. The government in Stockholm realized that it would have to make concessions as quickly as possible in order to preserve its sovereignty. Not only were the requests for help from Norway strictly rejected, but the Germans were actively supported. And at all levels. Iron ore production was particularly important. This became central to German weapons production, and from now on almost all iron ore had to be exported to Germany. Sweden was now also completely dependent on Germany in other respects, and 90% of exports went there. Later, the Germans even used Sweden as a transit corridor for their troops, which caused particular resentment among the population. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Finland allied itself with Germany, and over 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were deployed to Lapland. Sweden was now completely surrounded by Axis powers and had less and less freedom of choice. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary in 1942, "Sweden has done more for the German war effort than is usually assumed. They emphasize their neutrality, but in a way that is to our advantage." And there was another reason why Swedish independence was an advantage for the Germans. They still had a diplomatic mission in Stockholm, which was used as a hub for espionage, war logistics and propaganda. As Germany was otherwise almost completely cut off from the world, they had an arm to the outside world via neutral Sweden. Similar to Switzerland, through which banking transactions were carried out. Historians argue about whether Sweden had no real political choice but to accept the German conditions, or whether it could have taken a stronger stance against them. The fact is, however, that Sweden escaped the German occupation and remained at least officially neutral until the end of the war. Many Jews from neighboring countries were able to flee to Sweden, and as Germany began to weaken, exports of the important iron ore were reduced and the Allies were increasingly supported. So we can see that Swedish neutrality can be viewed critically, even though it has officially existed for more than 200 years. But last year it came to a sudden end. In the wake of the Russian war of aggression, Sweden declared the end of its policy of neutrality and sought to become a member of NATO.